Under freezing Montana rain, a mud-drenched man frantically dug a massive hole as his German shepherd stood guard. Neighbors drove by, whispering, mocking him, as the crazy vet finally digging his own grave. What drives a decorated war hero to abandon the world and hide like a ghost? What shocking truth was Ethan burying deep under the soil? And why would this madman's hole become a town's only hope when disaster struck? Ethan's secret and his bond with Buddy reveal a truth no one expected. A journey that will break your heart, then restore your faith. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and subscribe to join us. The sky over Detroit was a heavy, suffocating shroud of iron gray, weeping a relentless, freezing rain that turned the industrial soot into a black, slick sludge on the cracked pavement. Inside the precision metal fabrication plant, the atmosphere was a violent symphony of industrial aggression. The air hung thick with the acrid metallic tang of ozone, grinding dust, and pressurized hydraulic fluid that seemed to coat the back of the throat. High-pressure steam valves hissed like agitated serpents, and the rhythmic bone-shaking thud crunch of the heavy presses created a vibration that Ethan could feel deep in his marrow, a constant reminder of the world's indifference to the individual. Ethan Holloway stood at his assigned station, his 45-year-old frame possessing the rugged, broad-shouldered strength of a man who had spent his prime moving mountains and surviving hell. His hazel hair, cut short with military discipline, was heavily streaked with silver at the temples, a salt and pepper crown that matched the thin, neatly trimmed beard lining his sharp jawline. He was undeniably handsome, but it was a weary, weathered beauty. His face was a map of hard miles and sleepless nights, with crow's feet carved deep around eyes that had seen too much. Today, as every day, he wore his uniform of sanity, a rugged beige button-down shirt tucked neatly into solid dark charcoal chinos. He detested denim. The rough texture of jeans felt like a chaotic distraction, whereas the smooth, heavy-duty chino fabric provided a sense of order. Over the shirt, his heavy beige canvas jacket was his fortress. The weight of the canvas on his shoulders was a constant grounding pressure, a tactile reminder of where his body ended and the hostile world began. His hazel eyes, usually stoic and distant, were perpetually in motion, scanning the periphery of the Chuang Mai, with a hyper-vigilance that had been hardwired into his nervous system in the sun-baked dust of foreign valleys. At his feet, Buddy sat like a silent, fur-covered sentinel, a 90-pound sable German shepherd with dark, soulful amber eyes. Buddy was the only anchor Ethan had left in a sea of rising tides. Buddy wore no vest. Ethan didn't want the pitying looks or the whispered, "Thank you for your service," from strangers who had no idea what that service had cost. Buddy didn't need a label to know his mission. The dog's ears were constantly pivoting, tracking the movement of every overhead crane and the heavy footsteps of approaching coworkers. He sat so close that his warmth seeped through Ethan's charcoal chinos, a living, breathing anchor that kept Ethan from drifting away into the gray fog of his own mind. The morning had been a struggle of endurance. Every loud bang of a dropped wrench or the sudden shriek of a metal saw felt like a physical strike against Ethan's ears. He operated his press with a mechanical, almost haunting precision, his scarred hands moving in a blur of practiced efficiency. But as the clock neared noon, the sensory assault of the plant began to erode his defenses. The overhead lights hummed at a frequency that made his teeth ache, and the smell of hot oil began to transform, in his mind, into the scent of burning rubber and cordite. He felt the sweat beginning to bead on his silver-streaked brow, his heart starting to gallop like a trapped animal against his ribs. He tried to focus on the texture of his beige sleeve, trying to tell his brain that he was safe in Detroit, not thousands of miles away in a burning trench. Then, the cable on the secondary crane snapped. It wasn't just the sound, it was the sudden, violent release of tension, followed by a 20-foot steel girder slamming into the concrete floor with a sound that tore the world in half. To the other workers, it was a dangerous accident. To Ethan, it was a 107mm rocket slamming into the earth 10 feet away. The visual reality of the Detroit Chuang Mai vanished in an instant. The gray concrete was replaced by blinding, white-hot desert sand. The roar of the machines became the frantic, distorted shouting of men through radio static. The smell of ozone was now the metallic, copper-heavy scent of fresh blood. Ethan's breath hitched, his lungs suddenly feeling like they were filled with crushed glass. He didn't just flinch, he collapsed. His hands flew to his ears, his fingers digging into his scalp, as he slumped against a greasy steel support pillar, his body racked by a violent, uncontrollable tremor. Buddy was on him before the dust from the girder had even settled. The dog didn't bark in a panic. He moved with the calculated grace of a trained protector. He stepped between Ethan and the gathering crowd of gawking workers, his large, powerful frame a living barrier. He emitted a low, guttural rumble, a warning that vibrated in the air, telling the world to give his human space. Buddy then turned his focus inward, shoving his cold, wet nose under Ethan's chin, whining with a desperate, low-frequency sound that acted as a lifeline, slowly dragging Ethan back through the suffocating layers of trauma. Ethan gripped Buddy's thick fur, his knuckles white, his forehead pressed against the dog's neck as he gasped for air that finally felt like oxygen again. "Holloway, what is the meaning of this disaster?" The voice was like a rusted blade. It belonged to Arthur Henderson, the floor manager. Henderson was a man who seemed to have been carved out of sour wood, all sharp angles, a pinched face, and eyes the color of cold dishwater. He stood several feet away, his face flushed with a mixture of impatient anger and a visible fear of the snarling dog. Henderson didn't see a hero or a man in pain. He saw a damaged part that was slowing down his production line. "This is the third time in a month, Ethan. You're scaring the hell out of the new guys, and you've just cost us 40 minutes of floor time. This is a place of business, not a rehabilitation center." Ethan looked up, his face ashen, his hazel eyes wide and bloodshot. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rasp. He clung to the lapels of his beige canvas jacket, trying to ground himself. The sound? It was just the sound. "I'm sorry, Arthur. I'll get back to work." "No, you won't," Henderson snapped, his voice rising as he grew more emboldened by the presence of other workers. "I've been patient, but you're a liability. You're unstable, Holloway. I can't have a ticking time bomb working around heavy machinery. It's a safety risk I'm not willing to take for a head case who can't handle a little noise." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Your final check. I had it ready after the last time. Get your dog, get your gear, and get out. You don't belong in a shop like this." The silence that followed was more painful than the roar of the machines. Ethan stood up slowly, his legs feeling like they were made of water. He didn't argue or beg. He had seen that look in men's eyes before, the look you give a stray dog that you're about to kick. He walked to his locker in a daze, his dark charcoal chinos whispering against the concrete floor. He felt the weight of 50 pairs of eyes on his back. Some were filled with a shallow pity, but most were just cold, eager for the problem to be gone so they could return to their comfortable, mindless routines. He packed his few belongings, a worn notebook, a picture of his unit, and a heavy brass compass, into a small bag. He felt a profound, crushing sense of rongbo, abandonment. He was a man of 45, a master of his craft, yet he was being tossed into the gutter like a stripped bolt. As they stepped out of the factory into the biting October chill, Detroit felt like a predatory beast. Every screeching tire, every distant siren, and the rhythmic thump-thump of a nearby jackhammer felt like a tactical ambush. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, the freezing rain soaking into the canvas of his beige jacket, and looked down at Buddy. The dog stood perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed on Ethan's face, waiting for the next command. In that moment, the realization hit Ethan with the force of a tidal wave. He was trying to survive in a war zone that offered no peace, surrounded by people who viewed his scars as a defect rather than a badge of honor. "We're leaving, Buddy," Ethan whispered, his voice finally steadying. He thought about the small, isolated plot of land in Montana he had inherited from his grandfather, a place he had never visited because he was too afraid of the silence. But now silence was the only thing that felt like safety. He had a few $1,000s in savings and a truck that still ran. He wasn't just leaving a job, he was beginning a tactical retreat to a place where the mountains didn't talk back and the wind didn't judge. He looked toward the gray horizon of the west, his hazel eyes narrowing with a new, quiet purpose. He didn't belong to the city anymore. He belonged to the wild. The silence of Montana was not a void. It was a physical weight, a cold and ancient pressure that pressed against Ethan's eardrums with more force than any machine in Detroit ever could. Here, on the jagged shoulder of the ridge, the air tasted of frozen pine needles and the looming promise of a blizzard. Ethan Halloway stood before the raw, bleeding earth of the hillside, a man reclaimed by the soil. He looked at the vast, uncaring landscape through eyes that had finally stopped searching for snipers. Though the hypervigilance remained a permanent hum in his blood, he felt the familiar, stiff embrace of his rugged beige canvas jacket, the fabric already darkened by the freezing mountain mist. Underneath, his beige shirt was buttoned to the neck, tucked into his solid, dark charcoal chinos. He moved with a deliberate, slow-burning energy, his 45-year-old muscles protesting the transition from industrial labor to this primitive, bone-breaking task. His hazel hair was damp, the silver at his temples gleaming like frost under the bruised purple sky. He didn't use a backhoe or a drill. He used a rusted, heavy-duty spade in his own scarred hands, driving the iron into the frozen clay with a rhythmic, desperate intensity. Every nhat kuak, shovel stroke, was an exorcism. Ethan wasn't just excavating a space for a 6MX 4-emitter bunker. He was burying the echoes of the factory and the ghosts of the valley he had left behind. The earth was stubborn, filled with jagged shale and tangled roots that fought back like living things, but Ethan welcomed the resistance. The physical pain in his shoulders was an anchor, a way to stay present in the here and now instead of drifting back to the burning sands. He hauled stones, massive cold slabs of granite, carrying them against his chest, the weight straining the charcoal fabric of his chinos, as he laid the foundation of what he called his tactical retreat. He worked until his breath came in ragged plumes of white steam, his thin, silver-streaked beard catching the sleet that had begun to fall. He was a man building a fortress against a world that no longer had a place for him, carving a sanctuary out of the very mountain that seemed to want him gone. High above the dig site, Buddy stood as a motionless silhouette against the gray horizon. The 90-pound sable German shepherd, his black saddle a dark mark of strength, kept his amber eyes fixed on the winding access road below. Buddy didn't need a command to stand guard. He understood the stakes. His ears were perked, rotating like radar dishes to catch the distant groan of a straining engine long before a human ear could register it. He was the perfect sentinel, his presence allowing Ethan the luxury of focus. When Buddy finally gave a low, vibratory huff, not a bark, but a tactical alert, Ethan didn't stop digging, but his posture shifted, his grip on the shovel tightening as he prepared for the inevitable intrusion of the civilized world. The sound of the vehicle was a high-pitched electric whine, a sterile noise that cut through the mountain air like a scalpel. A silver high-tech electric truck crawled up the muddy track, looking like a polished toy against the rugged terrain. From the driver's side stepped Silas Vance, a man in his early 50s who carried himself with the unearned confidence of someone who had never bled for a living. Silas was dressed in a sleek, heated puffer vest, over a designer cashmere sweater, his skin smooth and unnaturally tan for the season. He was the head of the valley's development board, a man who viewed the wilderness as something to be paved and monetized. Beside him stood Sarah Thorne, a woman who seemed built of different materials entirely. Sarah, in her mid-30s, was tall and lean, her dark brown hair braided tightly to keep it from the wind. Her skin was pale and weathered by the high altitude, and her dark eyes held a profound, quiet sorrow that suggested she, too, knew what it was like to lose everything. She wore a heavy wool coat and a knitted scarf, standing several feet behind Silas as if reluctant to be part of his crusade. "Halloway, are you trying to reach China, or are you just digging a grave?" Silas's voice was thin and mocking, echoing off the rock faces. He gestured vaguely at the growing excavation, a smirk playing on his thin lips. "We're installing smart grids and fiber optic warmth down in the valley. Ethan, we have homes that breathe for you, and here you are, dressed in canvas and dirt, playing in a hole. It's 2026, man. Why would anyone choose to live like a caveman when the future is right down the hill? You're 45. You're going to blow out your heart before you finish the floor." Silas's eyes narrowed as he took in Ethan's charcoal chinos and the heavy rusted steel pressure door staged nearby. A relic of the past marked U.S. Signal Corps, 1944. To Silas, it was junk. To Ethan, it was the only thing he trusted to hold back the storm. Ethan didn't look up immediately. He hoisted one last stone onto the pile, the effort cording the muscles in his neck. When he finally turned, his hazel eyes were flat, reflecting none of Silas's derision. He stood tall, the rain beating on his beige jacket, his presence dwarfing the smaller man in the expensive vest. "The future depends on a wire, Silas," Ethan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate from the earth itself. "Wires break, batteries die. This hill, it doesn't need a firmware update to keep me safe." He looked past Silas towards Sarah, who was watching him with an intensity that felt like a silent question. Sarah didn't join in the mockery. She saw the calluses on his hands and the way Buddy stood protectively on the ridge. She recognized the look of a man who was building a wall not to keep people out, but to keep his own mind from shattering. "Ethan, the winter up here, it's not like Detroit," Sarah said, her voice soft but carrying clearly over the wind. She stepped forward, ignoring Silas's impatient huff. "The blizzards on this ridge can bury a house in hours. If your fortress isn't perfect, the mountain will just reclaim it. Do you have enough supplies? Do you have heat?" Her concern wasn't the shallow pity Ethan had felt in the factory. It was the practical curiosity of a fellow survivor. She saw the way he gripped his spade, the way his beige canvas jacket seemed to be the only thing keeping the cold at bay. She wondered what kind of war a man had to go through to think that living in a hole in Montana was the safe option. Silas scoffed, adjusting his heated vest. "Don't waste your breath, Sarah. He's a head case. That's what they called him in the valley, a ticking time bomb. Let him have his hole. But when the first frost hits and your hands are too frozen to hold that shovel Holloway, don't come looking for a handout from the smart grid." With a final disgusted look at the muddy excavation and the silent, amber-eyed dog, Silas turned back to his truck. Sarah lingered for a second longer, her gaze moving from the 1944 signal corps door back to Ethan's silver-streaked hair. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of respect for a struggle she didn't fully understand, before following Silas. As the electric whine of the truck faded into the distance, the mountain silence returned, heavier and colder than before. Ethan stood in the center of his future home, his boots caked in red clay, his charcoal chinos damp and heavy. He looked up at Buddy, who remained at his post, his sable fur matted with sleet. The judgment of the valley had come and gone, leaving only the reality of the work. Ethan picked up the spade again, his fingers numb, but his resolve ironclad. He wasn't building for Silas or Sarah or the valley. He was building for the silence. With every nhat-kuak, shovel stroke, he was carving out a piece of the world where he could finally breathe. Under the darkening Montana sky, the veteran and his dog continued their labor, two shadows against the vast, encroaching white of the winter. The Montana morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a gradual thinning of the oppressive gray mist, revealing a landscape etched in frost, and the brutal reality of the task at hand. Ethan Holloway stood before the gaping maw of his excavation, his 45-year-old body a map of localized aches and hardened resolve. He looked every bit the veteran engineer, his rugged beige canvas jacket now seasoned with the red clay of the hillside, protecting his beige button-down shirt from the biting wind that whipped through the pines. His solid dark charcoal chinos, the fabric heavy and resilient against the sharp shale, were tucked into his worn brown leather boots, showing no sign of the red tab or rivets of common denim. His hazel eyes, framed by the silver-streaked hair at his temples and the neat, silver-flecked beard along his jaw, were no longer clouded by the panic of Detroit. They were sharp, calculating the load-bearing capacity of the granite slabs he had hauled from the creek bed. Today was not about digging. It was about the art of the build, the transition from a hole in the dirt to a self-sustaining fortress of silence. The centerpiece of his sanctuary was to be a rocket mass heater, RMH, a pinnacle of primitive but sophisticated engineering that Ethan had mastered during his years in the U.S. Army Signal Corps, where staying warm in remote outposts was a matter of survival. He knelt on the cold earth, his charcoal chinos absorbing the dampness as he carefully constructed the J-tube combustion chamber. He wasn't using store-bought bricks. He was using fire-hardened stones and a specialized refractory mix he had devised himself. This wasn't just a fireplace, it was an engine of thermal efficiency. The vertical heat riser, which Ethan insulated with perlite he had scavenged from a local nursery, would allow the wood to burn at nearly 2,000 degrees, leaving almost no smoke or ash. The genius lay in the horizontal exhaust duct, which he channeled through a massive thermal bench made of packed earth and stone. This duct would snake beneath the floor of the 6MX formator bunker, radiating gentle, persistent heat upward through the very ground he would sleep on. To a passerby, it looked like a pile of mud and pipes, but to Ethan, it was a masterpiece of thermodynamics that would keep him alive when the temperature outside plummeted to 40 below. Beside him, Buddy was far more than a passive observer. He was a full-fledged member of the construction crew. The 90-pound sable German shepherd moved with an intelligent purpose that defied his canine nature. Ethan had fashioned a specialized pulling harness out of heavy-duty paracord and padded canvas, allowing Buddy to participate in the heavy lifting. The great dog, his black saddle standing out against his thick sable coat, would lean into the harness, his powerful hind legs driving into the earth as he dragged 6-foot pine logs from the timberline down to the dig site. There was a rhythmic synchronicity to their labor, a wordless dialogue between man and beast. When Ethan's hazel eyes grew distant, a sign of the fatigue pulling at his mental anchors, Buddy would sense the shift instantly. The dog would nudge a heavy plastic water canteen toward Ethan's hand, his dark amber eyes fixed on his master until Ethan took a drink and acknowledged the present moment. Buddy's most critical role, however, was his seismic sense. While Ethan worked inside the deepening vault, Buddy would patrol the upper lip of the ridge, his ears rotating like radar dishes. He would frequently press his snout against the freshly exposed earth of the bunker walls, sniffing deep into the fissures. If he sensed the subtle vibration of shifting soil or the dampness of a hidden spring that could lead to a low landslide, he would issue a sharp, insistent huff and pull at Ethan's beige sleeve until the veteran moved to reinforce the section with timber. As they were preparing the cob mixture, a traditional blend of clay, sand, and straw, a rusted, mud-splattered flatbed truck rattled up the access road, carrying a heavy load of raw clay and river sand. The driver was a new face in Ethan's solitary world, Grady Iron Eye Burke. Grady was a man who looked like he had been forged in a shipyard and left to weather in the sun. At 60 years old, he was wiry and tough, his skin the color and texture of an old baseball glove. One of his eyes was clouded by a thick, milky cataract, giving him a perpetually squinting, suspicious expression, while the other, the iron eye, remained a sharp, piercing blue. He wore greasy denim overalls over a tattered thermal shirt, and a thick tobacco-stained beard obscured most of his weathered features. Grady was a local scrap hauler and a retired Navy Seabee who had spent 30 years building runways in jungles and bridges in deserts. He climbed out of the truck, his movements stiff but practiced, and spat a stream of dark juice into the snow. He looked at the self-supporting stone arch Ethan was currently dry stacking over the bunker's entrance, a catenary arch that required no central pillar or mortar to stay upright. Catenary arch, huh? Grady's voice was a sandpaper growl, surprisingly deep for a man of his slight build. He stepped closer, ignoring Silas's previous warnings about the mole man. He ran a calloused hand over the granite slabs Ethan had meticulously shaped. Ain't seen a man stack stone like that since I was in the Philippines. Most of these folks down in the Thung Lung Valley think a house is something you buy in a box and plug into a wall. They don't understand gravity, son. They don't understand how the earth wants to push back. Grady looked at Buddy, who stood alert but didn't growl, sensing the lack of hostility in the old Seabee. And that dog, he's dragging your timber? Seen a lot of GSDs in my time, but that one's got a soldier's soul. Grady didn't offer pity. He offered a begrudging respect. He helped Ethan unload the clay, his missing pinky finger, lost to a winch cable in '92, not slowing him down in the least. He was a man who spoke in the language of structural loads and size strength, a welcome relief from Silas Vance's technological elitism. Once Grady departed, Ethan and Buddy returned to the soul of the build, the plastering. They worked together to apply the specialized clay mixture to the interior walls. Ethan applied the thick, cooling mud with a trowel, while Buddy used his powerful muzzle to pack the mixture into the lower crevices, where Ethan's hands couldn't easily reach. This clay wasn't just for aesthetics. It was a high-mass sealant that would fire-harden into a surface as durable as stone, trapping the heat from the RMH and preventing any moisture from seeping through the hillside. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, Ethan stood back, his beige canvas jacket caked in the gray-white mud, looking at the 6MX4 space. The circular steel door, marked U.S. Signal Corps, 1944, had been set into the stone arch, its rusted face a silent testament to the resilience of things built to last. The ventilation pipe peeked out from the roof, a small silver chimney that would soon breathe life into the cold hill. The bunker was no longer a hole. It was a living organism, a masterpiece of engineering that combined the ancient wisdom of stone with the modern physics of thermal mass. Ethan looked down at Buddy, whose sable fur was dusted with dried clay and frost. The dog leaned against Ethan's charcoal chinos, his warmth a steady comfort against the encroaching night. They had built this together, two outcasts, one human and one canine, carving a place of peace out of a world that had tried to discard them. The silence of Montana was still there, but it was no longer threatening. It was the silence of a job well done. The quiet before the first fire would roar in the belly of the rocket heater, turning the cold earth into a home. The Montana sky had finally surrendered its bruised purple hue to a charcoal abyss so deep it seemed to swallow the very light from the stars, leaving the high ridge in a state of absolute predatory darkness. Inside the 6MX4 bunker, the air was thick with the scent of drying clay and the faint, resinous aroma of pine sap. Yet the atmosphere was charged with a heavy electric tension that signaled the arrival of something far more violent than a typical autumn rain. Ethan Halloway sat on a low wooden bench near the rocket mass heater, his broad-shouldered 45-year-old frame hunched forward as he watched the singular, rhythmic glow of the fire through the small glass viewing port. He was dressed in his uniform of sanity. His beige button-down shirt was crisp despite the day's labor, and his solid, dark charcoal chinos, heavy-duty and devoid of any denim stiffness, felt like a reliable second skin against the cooling air. His beige canvas jacket hung on a nearby timber post, its heavy fabric still damp but standing like a hollow sentinel. Ethan's hazel eyes were vacant, fixed on the orange flickering light, his mind caught in the treacherous borderland between the peaceful silence of the mountains and the jagged white noise static of memories he had tried to bury beneath the Montana soil. Earlier that evening, a local delivery runner named Caleb Cully Miller had rattled up the access road in a battered mud-caked Jeep to drop off a final crate of canned rations. Cully was a lanky youth in his early 20s, possessing a shock of unruly bright red hair that escaped from beneath a frayed trucker hat and a face peppered with freckles that seemed to glow in the dim light. He had a nervous, jittery energy, his hands constantly fidgeting with a ring of keys, and a voice that was too loud for the mountain stillness. Cully had looked at the bunker with a mixture of awe and poorly hidden fear, his wide blue eyes darting toward the U.S. Signal Corps, 1944 steel door, as if he expected a ghost to emerge from the iron. He hadn't stayed long, clearly spooked by the isolation and the silent, silver-bearded veteran who spoke in gravelly monosyllables. But his brief presence had left a lingering trail of civilian anxiety that Ethan found difficult to shake. As Cully's Jeep vanished into the distance, the first cracks of the storm began to splinter the silence. It didn't start with rain, it started with the wind, a low, mournful howl that vibrated through the ventilation pipes of the bunker like a phantom flute. Then came the thunder. The first strike was distant, a low-frequency rumble that Ethan's lizard brain interpreted not as weather, but as the heavy rhythmic vibration of a convoy moving across a distant valley. He felt the muscles in his neck lock, his silver-streaked hair standing on end as his hypervigilance spiked into the red zone. Beside him, Buddy was already alert. The 90-pound sable German shepherd, his black saddle a dark shadow in the firelight, had moved from his resting place on the thermal mass bench to stand directly at Ethan's knee. Buddy didn't need to hear the thunder to know the storm was here. He felt the atmospheric pressure drop and saw the subtle tremor in Ethan's scarred hands as they gripped the fabric of his charcoal chinos. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on his master's face, tracking the dilation of his pupils and the shallow, rapid rise and fall of his chest. The second strike of thunder was no longer a rumble. It was a violent, bone-shaking explosion that detonated directly over the ridge, the sound echoing within the stone vault of the bunker. In an instant, the Montana hillside, was gone. The smell of drying clay was replaced by the acrid, metallic stench of burning rubber and cordite. The orange glow of the rocket heater became the searing, blinding flash of an IED. Ethan didn't see the walls of his sanctuary anymore. He saw the distorted, screaming faces of men he had failed to save, the air filled with the zip snap of incoming rounds and the wet, heavy thud of lead hitting earth. "Incoming! Get down!" Ethan roared, though his voice was little more than a strangled rasp. He threw himself off the bench, his charcoal chinos scraping against the dirt floor as he scrambled toward the corner, his hands flying to cover his ears in a desperate attempt to block out the artillery raining down on his roof. He was back in the Valley of Shadows, a 45-year-old ghost trapped in a 20-year-old nightmare, his body racking with a violent, uncontrollable tremor that threatened to shatter his very bones. Buddy didn't hesitate. He had been trained for this, not in a school, but in the crucible of Ethan's daily survival. As Ethan slumped against the cold stone wall, his eyes rolled back in a terrifying display of dissociation. The great German shepherd lunged forward. He didn't bark, for he knew noise only added to the chaos. Instead, Buddy used his 90 pounds of solid muscle as a tactical anchor. He threw himself across Ethan's lap and chest, pinning the veteran against the wall with the sheer weight of his body. This was deep pressure therapy, a biological override designed to force Ethan's nervous system to recognize the here and now. Buddy's heavy black saddleback pressed into Ethan's sternum, while the dog's head wedged itself firmly under Ethan's chin, forcing his master's head upward. Buddy began to emit a low, constant rumble from deep within his chest, a vibratory frequency that Ethan could feel through his beige shirt and charcoal chinos. It was the thrum of life, a counter-rhythm to the jagged, erratic pounding of Ethan's heart. The storm outside raged on, the rain now hitting the hill in sheets that sounded like sustained machine gun fire. But inside the bunker, the world was narrowing down to the contact point between man and dog. Ethan's fingers, which had been clawing at his scalp, slowly found purchase in Buddy's thick sable fur. He gripped the dog's neck with a strength born of desperation, his knuckles white against the dark fur. He buried his face into the warm, musky scent of Buddy's neck, the tears finally breaking through the wall of his stoicism. They were hot, silent tears that soaked into Buddy's coat, a release of years of Dawn Nain, suppressed agony that had no other outlet. I'm here," Ethan whispered into the dog's ear, though it was unclear if he was reassuring Buddy or himself. The weight of the dog was the only thing keeping him from drifting away into the abyss of his own mind. Buddy didn't flinch. He simply leaned harder, his amber eyes closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic, inviting Ethan to match the pace. Slowly, the combat zone began to recede. The flashes of light through the ventilation pipe were just lightning again, not muzzle flashes. The heavy thump of the rain was just water hitting the earth, not mortars hitting a perimeter. Ethan's breathing began to level out, his heart rate dropping as the grounding presence of his companion worked its magic. He felt the rough texture of his charcoal chinos against his legs and the warmth radiating from the thermal mass of the rocket heater, which was still quietly breathing fire in the center of the room. The 1944 signal corps door remained shut, a solid barrier between him and the hostile world outside. Ethan let out a long, shuddering breath, his body finally going limp against the wall as the panic attack exhausted its fuel. He didn't move for a long time, simply holding on to Buddy as if the dog were the last lifeboat on a dark and stormy sea. In the profound silence that followed the peak of the storm, Ethan realized that he wasn't alone in his struggle. He looked at Buddy, whose ears were still twitching at the distant thunder, and saw the same hypervigilance reflected in the dog's posture. They were two survivors of different wars, bound by a shared language of trauma and a singular, unbreakable bond of loyalty. Ethan reached out and stroked the dog's black saddleback, his hands finally steady. "You saved me again, Buddy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The dog looked up, his amber eyes bright in the fading firelight, and gave a single soft lick to Ethan's cheek before resting his head back on his master's knee. Between the stone walls of their fortress, amidst the cold Montana wilderness, they had found a Mo-Neo, anchor that no storm could ever tear away. Ethan closed his eyes, the warmth of the dog and the heater finally lulling him into a dreamless sleep, the first true rest he had known since leaving the factory. The morning following the great storm arrived with a crystalline clarity that only the high Montana altitudes could produce. The air so cold it felt brittle, as if the world might shatter if one breathed too deeply. Inside the bunker, the rocket mass heater breathed the steady, invisible warmth into the 6mx 4-meter space, the thermal mass of the stone bench holding the previous night's fire like a glowing secret. Ethan Holloway stood at his small wooden table, his 45-year-old hands steady as he carefully wiped the dust from several small glass jars. He was dressed in his signature beige button-down shirt, tucked into his solid dark charcoal chinos, and he reached for his beige canvas jacket, hanging by the heavy 1944 U.S. Signal Corps door. The jacket was a familiar weight, a second skin that protected him from both the mountain chill and the prying eyes of the world he had left behind. Beside him, Buddy was already at the door, his 90-pound sable frame tense with anticipation. The German Shepherd's black saddle was glossy in the dim light, and his amber eyes tracked Ethan's every move with the silent intelligence of a veteran partner. Buddy didn't need a vest to tell him he was on duty. His role as Ethan's shadow was ingrained in his very marrow. Before the snows fully claimed the ridge, Ethan had discovered a wild hive deep within a hollowed cedar, a late-season miracle of golden sweetness. With the calculated precision of an engineer, he had harvested a portion of the honey, leaving enough for the bees to survive the frost. Now, he filled the jars, the liquid gold viscous and smelling of summer wildflowers and pine needles. He knew the valley viewed him as a head case, a mole man, who had burrowed into the earth to escape a reality he couldn't handle. But Ethan's retreat wasn't born of hatred. It was born of a need for a silence that allowed him to be a man again. He didn't want their gratitude, and he certainly didn't want their pity, but he couldn't ignore the vulnerability of those who lived at the edge of the Thung Lung Valley, those who, like him, were often forgotten by the fast-moving world of smart grids and electric trucks. His first stop was the small, weathered cottage of Mrs. Martha Gable. Martha was 82 years old, a retired school teacher whose husband had been claimed by a harvesting accident a decade ago. She was a woman of diminutive stature, her spine slightly curved like a sapling in a heavy wind, with skin the texture of crumpled parchment and hair as white as the first frost. She lived alone with a deaf old tabby cat named Barnaby, a creature as scarred and slow as the house itself. Martha was known for her fierce independence, but Ethan had noticed the way she moved more slowly each time she came out to check her mailbox, her breath coming in shallow plumes of white steam. He approached her porch in the pre-dawn gray, moving with the silent tread he had mastered in the shadows of Kandahar. Buddy stood at the edge of the woods, a sable sentinel watching the road for any sign of Silas Vance or the other valley residents. Ethan placed a jar of honey on the small wicker table beside Martha's rocking chair, along with a small bundle of dry kindling he had chopped into perfect uniform slivers. He didn't knock, he didn't wait. He simply turned and vanished back into the tree line. Later that night, under the silver-blue glow of a waning moon, Ethan and Buddy moved toward the Miller farm, located 3 miles down the ridge. The owner, Elias Miller, no relation to Jack, was a man of 60 whose life had been a series of hard-won victories over the Montana soil. Elias was a broad-chested man with a permanent squint and a thick salt and pepper beard that obscured a jawline as jagged as the mountains. He had lost his only son to the same war that had shattered Ethan's peace, a tragedy that had left Elias hardened and suspicious of the world. Recently, a heavy branch from an ancient oak had splintered, crashing through a 20-foot section of his perimeter fence, leaving his livestock vulnerable to the coyotes that prowled the dark. Ethan arrived at the broken fence line with a leather roll of tools and several sturdy pine rails he had prepared in the bunker. He worked in the near-total darkness, his hazel eyes adjusted to the shadows, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a sea bee. He didn't use power tools that would scream through the night. He used a hand drill and a mallet, the rhythmic thump-thump of his work muffled by the wind. Buddy sat 10 yards away, his ears rotating like radar dishes, his nostrils flared to catch the scent of Elias or his hounds. To anyone watching from the farmhouse, Ethan would have been nothing more than a ghost, a shadow in a beige jacket blending into the timber. He reinforced the posts, bracing them against the winter gales, ensuring that the fence was stronger than it had been before the storm. It was a silent act of repair, a way of mending the world without having to speak to it. As the first hints of a pale, bruised dawn began to bleed over the horizon, Ethan climbed back up the ridge to a high rocky outcropping that overlooked Martha Gable's cottage. From this distance he was invisible, a speck of beige and charcoal against the granite. He watched as Martha opened her door, wrapped in a heavy shawl. He saw the moment she discovered the honey. Even from 100 yards away, he could see the way she straightened her back, her small hands clutching the jar as if it were a holy relic. She looked toward the woods, her eyes searching the shadows. And for a fleeting second, Ethan imagined he saw a smile cross her weathered face. He didn't need her to know his name. He didn't need her to know that he was the crazy veteran from the hill. He only needed to know that she had a bit of warmth for the winter, a neo anchor of sweetness in her solitary life. Beside him, Buddy gave a soft, vibratory huff, leaning his weight against Ethan's charcoal chinos. The dog's amber eyes were focused on the valley below, sensing the world waking up, the whir of Silas Vance's electric truck in the distance, the hum of the smart world that had no room for shadows. Ethan reached down and scratched the thick fur behind Buddy's ears, his heart feeling a strange, quiet lightness. In Detroit, his scars had been a source of shame, a defect that made him a liability. Here, in the silence of the Montana shadows, those same scars allowed him to move unseen, to be a silent guardian for a community that had turned its back on him. He wasn't just building a bunker, he was building a legacy of quiet resilience. As the sun finally crested the peaks, bathing the ridge in a cold, golden light, Ethan and Buddy turned back toward the safety of their earthen home, two soldiers retreating into the peace they had built with their own hands. The Montana dawn arrived with a razor-sharp stillness, the air tasting of pulverized diamonds under a sky of bruised purple and cold, indifferent gold. Frost clung to the pines like a second skin, and the world was an expanse of predatory silence that only the biting wind dared to break. Ethan Holloway stood outside the heavy steel pressure door of his bunker. A circular slab of history marked U.S. Signal Corps, 1944, that looked more like a shield than a portal. He was a man defined by his layers, both physical and mental, dressed in his rugged beige button-down shirt and the heavy beige canvas jacket that had become his modern-day hauberk. His solid, dark charcoal chinos, fabric chosen for its silent strength and lack of civilian vanity, were tucked into brown boots caked with the frozen red clay of the ridge. At 45, Ethan's frame was a testament to a life of heavy lifting and tactical endurance. His hazel hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his thin, silver-flecked beard caught the moisture of his breath in the freezing air. Beside him, Buddy sat as an unmoving statue of sable fur and black saddle muscle, his dark amber eyes fixed on the winding road below. The usual peace was suddenly shattered by a sound that didn't belong to the thung-lung valley, not the soft, high-pitched whine of an electric motor, but the deep, guttural thrum of a high-displacement turbo-diesel engine, a mechanical growl that Ethan recognized as the heartbeat of the military machine he had tried to leave behind. As the matte olive-drab armored SUV crested the ridge, a small group of townspeople, including a perplexed Silas Vance and a wide-eyed Sarah Thorne, watched from a distance. The vehicle came to a halt 20 yards from Ethan's earthen fortress, its presence an intrusion of cold, calculated power. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out who seemed to have been carved from the same granite as the surrounding peaks. This was Lieutenant General Marcus Sterling. At 58, Sterling was a monolith of military discipline, his square jaw clean-shaven and his flinty eyes possessing a piercing, predatory intelligence. He wore his service uniform with a crispness that defied the rugged terrain, the 4 stars on his shoulders gleaming in the cold mountain sun. Sterling was a man who had spent 3 decades commanding the impossible, a leader who viewed the world as a series of strategic objectives to be seized. To the shock of the onlookers, the general didn't issue an order. Instead, he snapped his heels together and delivered a rigid, formal salute to the man in the beige jacket. "Major Holloway," Sterling's voice was a sandpaper growl that silenced the wind. "I've spent months tracking you to this ridge. The Pentagon is facing a structural collapse in the northern supply corridor that only your specific engineering genius can resolve. We need a senior strategic consultant, Ethan. Your commission is ready, and your security clearance is fully restored. There is a seat on a transport waiting for you right now." Ethan stood perfectly still, his hand resting on Buddy's neck, feeling the dog's steady warmth through the fabric of his charcoal chinos. He looked at the general, then at the bunker he had built with his own scarred hands, the rocket mass heater breathing warmth into the earth, the self-supporting stone arch that defied the mountain's weight. For a moment, the allure of his old life, the hierarchy, the clear-cut mission, the respect of his peers, tugged at him like a powerful, familiar tide. He saw Sarah Thorne watching him from the perimeter, her dark brown hair whipped by the wind, her pale face tight with an unreadable emotion. She saw the flick of recognition in Ethan's eyes, the shadow of the major he once was. But the silence of the mountain had taught Ethan a different kind of discipline. "General," Ethan began, his voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that the 4 stars on Sterling's shoulders couldn't match. "I am honored, but I've already been deployed to a new theater of operations. This ridge, this bunker, this is my primary objective now." Sterling's brow furrowed, his flinty eyes searching Ethan's face for a sign of madness. "Ethan, you're wasted out here. You belong where the action is, not digging in the dirt like an outcast." Ethan shook his head slowly, a faint, weary smile touching his lips as he looked at the general. "My biggest battlefield isn't in the northern provinces anymore, Marcus. It's right here, between my own ears. I spent 20 years fighting everyone else's wars, and I nearly lost my soul to the noise and the copper scent of the desert. Now, I'm fighting to win back my own peace, to conquer the ghosts that followed me home. If I leave this hill now to build your bridges, those ghosts win the war. My victory isn't measured in medals or rank anymore. It's measured in the silence of a night without nightmares and the steady breath of my dog. This bunker isn't a hole I'm hiding in. It's the ground I'm finally standing on." The silence that followed was heavy, the air between the two men crackling with the weight of 2 different kinds of honor. Sterling stared at Ethan for a long minute, looking past the silver-streaked hair and the mud-stained chinos to the iron-clad resolve underneath. He realized that Ethan hadn't broken. He had simply evolved into something the military didn't have a manual for. General Sterling let out a slow, measured breath and nodded, a look of profound admiration crossing his weathered features. He turned his cold gaze towards Silas Vance and the other townspeople, his voice projecting with a command that made Silas instinctively shrink back. "You people should consider yourselves fortunate," the general declared, his voice echoing off the ridge. "You have a man living among you who has saved more lives than most of you will ever know. He is a soldier who has earned the right to his own peace. I suggest you treat him with the dignity he has earned, or you'll answer to the memory of the men he led." With a final, respectful nod to Ethan and a brief pat on Buddy's sable head, Sterling climbed back into the SUV. As the vehicle rumbled back down the mountain, the name Mole Man was permanently erased from the town's vocabulary. Silas Vance stood frozen, his smart life suddenly feeling small and fragile, while Sarah Thorne lingered, her dark eyes reflecting a new, deep-seated respect. She saw Ethan turn back to his work, his beige canvas jacket a splash of stubborn color against the gray stone. He wasn't a lunatic or a victim. He was a master of his own destiny, a man who had chosen the hard path of healing over the easy path of glory. The inner battlefield was far from won, but as Ethan gripped his shovel and Buddy took his post, they knew they had successfully held the ridge. The sky did not simply darken, it collapsed, a monolithic wall of white and iron gray that swept across the Montana peaks with the velocity of an avalanche. This was the Great White, a record-shattering blizzard that arrived weeks ahead of the most pessimistic forecasts, carrying a barometric drop so sharp it made Ethan's old combat injuries throb with a dull, insistent ache. By mid-afternoon, the world beyond the ridge had vanished into a blinding kaleidoscope of ice crystals, the wind roaring at 70 miles per hour, turning the towering pines into whipped, groaning specters. Below, in the Thung Lung Valley, the pride of Silas Vance's smart grid was the first to fall. The high-tension lines, weighed down by 6 inches of instantaneous ice and lashed by the gale, snapped with the rhythmic crack of a giant's whip, sending cascades of blue sparks into the white abyss, before the entire town was plunged into a suffocating, lightless void. In the sleek modular homes that Silas had championed, the smart thermostats flickered once and died, the glass-walled living rooms becoming elegant refrigerators as the automated heating systems, stripped of their digital heartbeat, surrendered to the creeping frost. The very technology meant to provide ultimate comfort had become a liability, leaving the residents huddled in expensive synthetic blankets, listening to the predatory howl of the storm as their pipes began to groan and the temperature inside plummeted toward the lethal freezing point. Inside the 6M x 4mm earthen sanctuary, however, the reality was profoundly different. Ethan Halloway sat on the thick thermal bench of his rocket mass heater, the heat radiating through his solid dark charcoal chinos and into his weary muscles with a steady, bone-deep warmth that no electric furnace could replicate. He was dressed for the extremity, his beige button-down shirt tucked neatly, and his rugged beige canvas jacket draped over his shoulders, a heavy, dependable layer that smelled faintly of the wood smoke and the mountain earth. At 45, Ethan's hazel eyes were calm, their previous hypervigilance channeled into the rhythmic maintenance of his sanctuary. He watched the small glow of the combustion chamber, the fire burning at a ferocious 2,000 degrees, yet consuming only a handful of pine branches. The ingenuity of his engineering was now his salvation. The horizontal exhaust duct snaking beneath the cob and stone floor had turned the entire ground into a massive thermal battery. While the surface of the hill was being scoured by a wind that could freeze exposed skin in seconds, the air inside the bunker remained a constant balmy 70 degrees, the silence thick and comforting, muffled by 6 feet of insulating earth. Buddy, the 90-pound sable German shepherd, lay stretched out across the warm floor, his black saddle rising and falling with a slow, contented breath. His dark amber eyes were half closed, his ears occasionally twitching at the muffled thump of a falling branch far above. But he showed none of the anxiety that was currently paralyzing the town below. Buddy knew they were safe. He had helped drag the timber, he had sniffed the seals of the 1944 U.S. Signal Corps door, and he trusted the man in the beige jacket. Earlier that day, before the whiteout became absolute, a final visitor had sought refuge near the ridge. Deputy Sheriff Elias Eli Thorne, Sarah Thorne's younger brother. Eli was a man of 28, possessing a wiry, athletic build, and a face that was a more rugged, sunburnt version of his sister's. He had a shock of dark hair that was constantly matted by his patrol hat, and a pair of restless, observant gray eyes. Eli was known for his calm under pressure, a trait earned from a youth spent navigating these mountains. But today his expression was etched with a rare, crystalline fear. He had been checking the upper pass when his cruiser was nearly swept off the road, and he had struggled to Ethan's door, his service uniform encrusted in a thick shell of ice. Eli sat on a stool near the heater, clutching a tin mug of coffee Ethan had prepared on the stove's surface. He looked around the bunker with a mixture of disbelief and profound respect, his eyes lingering on the self-supporting stone arch and the way the heat seemed to pulse from the very floor. "Silas is down there in the dark, Ethan," Eli murmured, his voice raspy from the cold. "His house is a goddamn icebox. He's got $2 million in solar glass and automated sensors, and right now, he can't even boil a pot of water. The whole grid is down from here to Great Falls. They're calling it a 100-year event." Eli glanced at Buddy, who had nudged the deputy's boot with a friendly snout, and then back at Ethan. "Everyone in the valley called you a lunatic for burrowing into the hill. Now, I suspect they'd give everything they own to be sitting where I am." Ethan didn't gloat. There was no room for spite in the face of the mountain's wrath. He merely adjusted the air intake on the heater, his silver-streaked hair catching the orange light. "The earth doesn't care about your bank account, Eli. It only cares if you know how to listen to it," Ethan replied, his gravelly voice steady. As the night deepened, the storm reached its crescendo, the wind shrieking through the ventilation pipes with a sound like a wounded beast. Outside, the civilized world was in a state of absolute paralysis. Cars were buried to their roofs, and the silent, dark houses of the valley were being slowly reclaimed by the white. But underground, Ethan and Buddy moved in a slow, peaceful dance of survival. Ethan checked the secondary ventilation shaft, ensuring the snow hadn't blocked the oxygen flow, a design feature he had protected with a specialized snorkel cap. He felt a strange sense of victory, not over Silas or the town, but over the ghosts of his own past. In the chaos of the blizzard, his mind was finally quiet. The roar of the wind didn't sound like artillery anymore. It just sounded like the mountain breathing. He realized that by building this masterpiece of engineering, he hadn't just built a shelter for his body. He had built a fortress for his sanity. He looked at the heavy steel door, the rusted 1944 inscription, a reminder of a time when things were built to endure, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the silence. The chapter concluded with Ethan leaning back against the warm stone wall, his hand resting on Buddy's thick sable fur. The deputy had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep on the thermal bench, his breathing synchronized with the dog's. They were an island of warmth in a sea of ice, a testament to the power of primitive, honest labor over the fragile complexity of the modern world. Ethan closed his eyes, the gentle thrum of the rocket heater, a lullaby against the storm, knowing that when the sun finally rose over the paralyzed city, he would be the one stepping out into the white, ready to lead the rescue. He was no longer the outcast. He was the Mo anchor that the Thunglung Valley didn't yet know it desperately needed. The blizzard had reached a state of transcendental violence, a white wall of screaming wind that obliterated the horizon and turned the world into a featureless, lethal void. Inside the 6M X4MMA bunker, the rocket mass heater continued its silent thermal vigil, the floor radiating a persistent warmth that seemed to defy the chaos raging only feet above. Ethan Holloway had been sitting on the thermal bench, his 45-year-old frame finally relaxing after hours of shoring up the secondary ventilation duct, his beige button-down shirt damp with exertion, and his solid dark charcoal chinos caked with the fine dust of the mountain. He reached for his beige canvas jacket, the heavy fabric cold to the touch but familiar, a protective shell against the predatory chill. He was about to close his hazel eyes for a brief, earned rest when Buddy, the 90-pound sable German shepherd, suddenly bolted upright. The dog's black saddle fur bristled, and his dark amber eyes were fixed on the heavy 1944 U.S. Signal Corps steel door. Buddy didn't growl. He issued a sharp, repetitive contact bark, a tactical alert Ethan hadn't heard since the dog had sensed a shifting perimeter in a desert canyon years ago. The dog's ears were rotating frantically, picking up a sound buried beneath the roar of the gale, a rhythmic, muffled thudding, the desperate SOS of metal striking metal. Ethan didn't hesitate. The soldier's instinct, buried beneath layers of trauma and dirt, surged to the surface with the force of an electric shock. He checked his heavy leather gloves, grabbed a collapsible shovel and a structural shoring jack from his engineering kit, and signaled to Buddy. As they stepped out through the pressure door into the whiteout, the wind hit Ethan with the force of a physical blow, threatening to sweep his 45-year-old frame off the ridge. The cold was a jagged blade that cut through even the heavy canvas of his jacket, but he leaned into it, his charcoal chinos offering a sturdy, wind-resistant barrier as he followed Buddy into the abyss. The dog moved with an uncanny certainty, his powerful hind legs driving through drifts that were already 4 feet deep, his black saddle a dim anchor in the swirling white. They moved toward the treacherous junction of the upper access road, where Buddy began to dig furiously into a massive, unnatural mound of snow that had accumulated near a steep embankment. Beneath the white, Ethan saw the faint, desperate flicker of a hazard light and the tip of a radio antenna. It was a vehicle buried under what looked like 20 tons of wind-driven snow and a secondary slide of frozen shale. Inside the crushed cabin of the SUV was Sheriff Big Jim Callahan, the primary lawman of the valley for over 2 decades. Jim was a barrel-chested man of 55, possessing a face like a weathered road map, and a thick iron-gray mustache that usually bristled with authority. He was a man who prided himself on being the protector of the Thunglung Valley, a stoic figure who had spent his life pulling others out of trouble, but now he was pinned behind the steering wheel, the weight of the snow already beginning to buckle the roof of the vehicle. Beside him was his wife, Ellen Callahan, a petite woman in her late 40s with resilient blue eyes and short salt and pepper hair that was now matted with blood from a small scalp wound. Huddled between them was their 7-year-old daughter, Lucy, her face as pale as the snow outside, her wide, terrified eyes fixed on the groaning metal ceiling. Jim's usual lawman's mask had shattered, replaced by the raw, crystalline terror of a father who realized he was trapped in a coffin made of steel and ice. Ethan assessed the situation with the cold, rapid-fire logic of a Signal Corps engineer. The pressure of the snow was uneven. If he simply dug a hole to the door, the shift in weight would cause the roof to collapse entirely, crushing the occupants. "Jim, don't move!" Ethan roared over the wind, his voice a gravelly command that cut through the sheriff's panic. He didn't dig toward the vehicle, he dug beside it, creating a rat-hole tunnel stabilized by the structural shoring jack he had carried. He used his knowledge of soil and weight distribution to create a temporary earth and snow arch, a masterpiece of battlefield engineering executed in the heart of a blizzard. He moved with a frantic but disciplined economy of motion, his beige canvas jacket caked in ice, his charcoal chinos soaked but never failing him. Buddy stood at the entrance of the dig site, his 90-pound body shielding the opening from the wind, his ears pivoting to monitor the stability of the ridge above. As the roof of the SUV gave a final, ominous groan, Ethan reached the passenger side window. He shattered the glass with the butt of his shovel and began the extraction. He pulled Lucy out first, her small body trembling as he handed her to Buddy, who gripped her coat gently in his teeth to guide her toward the safety of the bunker. Next was Ellen, who crawled through the narrow shored tunnel with a quiet, fierce determination. Finally, Ethan reached for Jim. The big man was wedged tight, his breathing shallow in the oxygen-depleted cabin. "Come on, Jim! One push!" Ethan grunted, his muscles screaming as he leveraged his shoulder against the buckling pillar. With a final violent heave, he dragged the sheriff into the tunnel, just as the weight of the mountain finally won. The SUV's roof flattening into the seats with a sickening crunch that vibrated through the ground. They scrambled back through the rat hole, the tunnel collapsing behind them like a dying lung. The journey back to the bunker was a blur of freezing agony and sheer willpower. Ethan carried Lucy against his chest, her face tucked into the collar of his beige jacket, while Jim and Ellen clung to Buddy's harness, the great dog acting as a living compass through the blinding white. When they finally stumbled through the 1944 Signal Corps door and into the warmth of the 6-mix 4mm sanctuary, the transition was jarring. The air inside was 70 degrees, the smell of pine and the radiant heat of the stone floor hitting them like a benediction. Eli Thorne, who had been maintaining the fire, jumped to his feet to help the frozen family, his gray eyes wide with shock. Sarah Thorne, who had also arrived earlier seeking her brother, moved with instinctive grace to wrap Lucy in a wool blanket, her pale face softening with a profound, quiet relief as she looked at Ethan. Ethan didn't join the frantic conversation that followed. He didn't accept the sheriff's choked, emotional thanks or Ellen's tearful gaze. As the adrenaline began to recede, the old shadows of Detroit and the desert began to creep back in. He felt the weight of their eyes on him, the same eyes that had once viewed him as a head case or a mole man. And he found he couldn't breathe in the sudden crowdedness of his sanctuary. He stripped off his frozen beige canvas jacket, revealing his beige shirt, and moved silently toward the darkest corner of the bunker near the storage crates. He sat on the floor, his back against the cold stone, his solid dark charcoal chinos caked in ice and red clay. He pulled a small whetstone from his pocket and began to sharpen a hand tool, the rhythmic shh of the stone against metal, the only anchor he needed. Buddy, sensing the shift in Ethan's frequency, immediately left the warmth of the heater and the attention of the Callahans to lie down beside his master. The dog placed his heavy sable head on Ethan's knee, his amber eyes never leaving Ethan's face. In the shadows of his own fortress, surrounded by the people he had just saved, Ethan Halloway retreated into the silence he had built for himself. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want to be the center of their Thung Lung Valley legends. He only wanted to be the man who survived the storm. As the sheriff's family found warmth and safety on the thermal bench, the veteran and his dog remained in the darkness, two sentinels of a war that would never truly end, bound together by a bond that required no words and no gratitude. The morning following the great white blizzard broke with a sky so fiercely blue it felt like an ache against the eyes, a crystalline silence having settled over the Montana ridge that was as profound as it was beautiful. The 70-mile-per-hour winds had vanished, leaving behind a world sculpted in undulating drifts of pure, blinding white that buried the lower valley in a state of absolute, frozen paralysis. Inside the 6mm 4mm bunker, the rocket mass heater continued its rhythmic thrum, the thermal mass of the stone and cob floor holding a reservoir of heat that made the sub-zero temperatures outside seem like a distant, forgotten dream. Ethan Holloway stood near the heavy steel 1944 U.S. Signal Corps door, his 45-year-old frame silhouette against the faint light filtering through the high ventilation shafts. He was dressed in his uniform of sanity, his beige button-down shirt neatly pressed despite the harrowing rescue of the previous night, and his solid dark charcoal chinos, heavy-duty and unyielding, a stark contrast to the flimsy synthetic fabrics favored by the valley. He reached for his beige canvas jacket, the rugged fabric having dried over the warm stones, and pulled it on, feeling the weight settle like a familiar armor. Beside him, Buddy was already at attention, his 90-pound sable frame a powerhouse of focused energy, his dark amber eyes fixed on the door. The German shepherd's black saddle was a dark slash against his thick winter coat, and his ears were perked, catching a sound that Ethan's ears, dulled by years of industrial noise and artillery, hadn't yet registered: the rhythmic crunch hiss of snowshoes and the labored breathing of a group of people climbing the ridge. When Ethan finally swung the heavy pressure door open, the transition from the dim, warm amber of the bunker to the blinding brilliance of the snow was jarring. Standing on the ridge was a column of townspeople, a sight that made Ethan's hyper-vigilance spike, his hazel eyes instinctively scanning the group for threats. But there were no mocking smirks today. At the head of the group was Silas Vance, though he was a man transformed. Gone was the smug tech elitist who had ridiculed Ethan's hole in the dirt. Silas looked smaller, his expensive heated vest useless, and his face pale and chapped from the cold. Beside him stood Sarah Thorne, her lean, tall frame wrapped in a heavy wool coat. Her shoulder-length dark brown hair was slightly tousled by the wind, and her pale skin, though reddened by the frost, seemed to glow with a quiet, fierce respect. She carried a heavy iron pot, while others behind her lugged sacks of root vegetables and jars of preserved venison. Among the new faces was Old Man Whitaker, the town's eldest resident at 85. Whitaker was a man of ancient gnarled features, his face a landscape of deep-set wrinkles and a thick yellowish beard that looked like dried corn silk. He walked with a stout hickory cane, his movements slow, but possessing a dignity that the storm hadn't managed to break. Behind him was young Mrs. Higgins, a mother of 3 who looked exhausted, her eyes wide with a mixture of shame and gratitude as she clutched a loaf of homemade bread to her chest. We didn't know where else to go, Holloway," Silas began, his voice raspy and devoid of its usual arrogance. He looked at the bunker, then at the sheriff's family, who were just beginning to stir on the warm thermal bench inside. "The Thung Lung Valley is frozen. The smart grid won't be up for a week. We have food, but no way to cook it, no way to stay warm. We came to say thank you for the Callahans, and to ask for a place at your fire." Ethan stared at them, his fingers curling into the canvas of his sleeves. For years he had been the outcast, the head case they whispered about in the grocery store. His instinct was to shut the door, to retreat back into the silence he had built. But he looked at Buddy, who had stepped forward not to growl, but to give a soft, welcoming huff towards Sarah. Ethan looked at Sarah's eyes, the quiet strength and the sorrow he had recognized before, and he felt the last wall of his isolation begin to crumble. He stepped aside, the movement slow and deliberate. "Bring the wood in," Ethan said, his gravelly voice echoing in the clear air. "And the food. The floor is warm." The bunker, once a solitary sanctuary for a man and his dog, suddenly became the beating heart of the community. As the townspeople filed in, the 6MX4MM space felt smaller, yet it didn't feel like the claustrophobic trap Ethan had feared. The air became thick with the scent of wood smoke, damp wool, and the rich, earthy aroma of the food they brought. Ethan demonstrated the versatility of the rocket mass heater, showing them how the large flat stone surface above the combustion chamber could serve as a massive cooktop. Sarah Thorne took charge of the kitchen duties, her hands moving with an instinctive grace as she began to sear the venison. She looked at Ethan as he helped Silas move a heavy stone to create more seating. "You built a miracle here, Ethan," she whispered, her voice carrying a warmth that rivaled the heater. "You didn't just build a bunker, you built a home. I'm sorry we couldn't see it until the lights went out." As the meal progressed, the noise of the people began to change in Ethan's mind. It wasn't the aggressive, chaotic noise of the fabrication plant or the terrifying roar of the desert. It was the sound of life, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, the low hum of conversation, and the soft laughter of Lucy Callahan as she played with Buddy on the warm floor. They cooked a massive communal stew, the steam rising to the arched stone ceiling. When the food was ready, they sat together on the thermal bench and the floor, the heat from the ground seeping through their clothes. Silas Vance sat near Ethan, his head bowed. "I called you a lunatic, Jack," Silas said, using Ethan's old military call sign for the first time. "I thought progress meant things you could plug into a wall. I was wrong. Progress is knowing how to survive when the walls come down. I owe you an apology. We all do." One by one, the others nodded, their voices a soft chorus of, "I'm sorry," and "thank you." Ethan sat in his corner, his back against the stone, his solid dark charcoal chinos reflecting the orange glow of the fire. He didn't give a grand speech. He wasn't a man of many words. But as he looked around the room, at Old Man Whitaker savoring the warmth, at the Higgins children eating their stew, and at Buddy resting his sable head on Sarah's knee, he felt a profound sense of hoagiai, reconciliation. The battlefield between him and the town had finally seen a ceasefire. He realized that his tactical retreat had led him to a position of strength, not for the purpose of hiding, but for the purpose of leading. The prejudice that had driven him from Detroit and isolated him on this ridge was being washed away by the simple act of sharing a meal in the dark. He looked at the 1944 Signal Corps door and realized it was no longer a barrier to keep people out. It was a gate that he had chosen to open. As the evening faded into a peaceful moonlit night, the townspeople began to settle in for a night of safety. Ethan walked outside for a moment, the cold air a refreshing contrast to the crowded warmth of the bunker. He looked up at the stars, which seemed to burn with a new intensity. He was still a man with scars. The ghosts of the past would always be there, whispering in the shadows. But they didn't have the power to drown out the silence anymore. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Sarah. She didn't say anything, but she stood with him in the cold, a silent partner in the peace they had found. Buddy joined them, his amber eyes reflecting the starlight. Ethan Holloway, the veteran who had come to Montana to die in a hole, had finally found a reason to live on the mountain. The meal of reconciliation had fed more than just their bodies. It had fed the soul of the Thung Lung Valley, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he had truly come home. The great Montana thaw began not with a roar, but with a rhythmic, crystal-clear drip-drop of melting icicles against the granite lip of the ridge. The great white blizzard had finally surrendered, leaving behind a valley that was waking up to a new reality, one where the fragile smart grids were being repaired, but the hearts of the people had been permanently altered by the silence. Ethan Holloway stood at the threshold of his 6MX Forum sanctuary, his 45-year-old frame silhouetted against the burgeoning light of a late March morning. He looked rugged and restored, his beige button-down shirt tucked into his solid dark charcoal chinos, the fabric clean and sturdy, a testament to his disciplined life. He pulled on his beige canvas jacket, the familiar weight of the fabric serving as a comfort rather than a cage. His hazel hair, silver-streaked at the temples, caught the morning sun, and his thin, silver-flecked beard was neatly trimmed, framing a face that had finally begun to shed the haunted vacancy of Detroit. Beside him, Buddy sat as a majestic sable sentinel, his black saddle glossy and his dark amber eyes scanning the thawing forest with a quiet, intelligent joy. Buddy didn't need a vest. He was the living heartbeat of the ridge, a dog who had proven that loyalty was the strongest material in the world. Over the past few months, the bunker had evolved. It was no longer just a tactical retreat for an outcast. It had become a beacon. Ethan had decided to transform the site into a dedicated sanctuary he called the Soul's Shield, a center for veterans struggling with the same invisible wounds that had once driven him into the earth. The interior, still warmed by the masterful rocket mass heater, had been expanded with a small, timber-framed addition that served as a communal workshop. Here, Ethan hosted men like Master Sergeant David Grizz Miller, a new arrival to the Thung Lung Valley. Grizz was 50 years old, a bear of a man, with a chest like a barrel and hands that were perpetually stained with grease and wood ash. He had lost his left eye to a shrapnel burst into Crit, replaced now by a milky blue orb that didn't move, giving him a terrifying, unblinking stare that masked a heart of pure, fragile glass. Grizz struggled with the static, the constant crushing anxiety of civilian life, and he had found his first night of true sleep on the thermal bench of Ethan's bunker. Alongside him was Corporal Little Pete Rossi, a wiry 24-year-old with twitchy bird-like movements and a face covered in faded acne scars. Pete rarely spoke, his vocal cords damaged by smoke inhalation, but his eyes were wide and searching, always looking for an exit until Ethan taught him how to focus his energy on the rhythmic, honest labor of stacking stone. Ethan sat with them around the stone heater, the scent of pine tea and cedar shavings filling the air. He didn't lecture them from a manual. He spoke as a man who had walked through the fire and found the water. PTSD isn't a malfunction, Grizz, Ethan said, his gravelly voice steady and resonant, reaching into the corners of the stone vault. It isn't a sign that you're broken or weak. It's an honor scar. It's the weight of the shield you carried for people who will never know your name. Your mind didn't fail you. It adapted to keep you alive in a world that demanded you be a monster. Now, we're just learning how to tell the body that the war is over. He watched Pete Rossi's hands finally stop shaking as the young man gripped a piece of sandpaper. Ethan had become a teacher of empathy, not just for the veterans, but for the townspeople as well. Once a month, he opened the 1944 U.S. Signal Corps door to the residents of the valley, including Silas Vance and Sarah Thorne, to help them understand the soldier's soul. Silas Vance had become the center's most unlikely benefactor, using his resources to help Ethan navigate the legal complexities of land use. Silas was still a man of technology, but he no longer viewed it as a replacement for human resilience. Sarah Thorne, however, was the center's quiet architect of healing. She had grown even more lean and graceful over the winter, her dark brown hair often caught in a simple braid that draped over her wool coat. Her pale skin was now sun-kissed from long walks up the ridge, and the deep sorrow in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, fierce light of purpose. She worked with the veterans' families, teaching them how to recognize the silent alarms and how to be a Neo anchor when the storms of memory returned. One afternoon, Sarah brought a new companion to the ridge, a three-legged stray cat named Tripod, a tough, orange-furred creature that had survived a coyote attack. Tripod, despite his disability, moved with a defiant, limping pride, and he had taken a particular liking to Buddy, often curling up against the dog's warm, black saddle near the heater. The veterans saw themselves in the cat, scarred, altered, but still standing. The transition from the mole man to the guardian of the ridge was complete. Ethan had found a way to use his engineering skills to build something far more durable than stone or steel. He was building a legacy of understanding. He taught the townspeople that when a veteran flinched at a loud noise, it wasn't a liability, but a reflex of a protector who was still on duty. He taught them that silence wasn't something to be feared, but a space where a soul could finally catch its breath. The valley no longer whispered about Ethan Halloway in hushed, judgmental tones. They spoke of him with a profound, crystalline respect, the kind reserved for men who have conquered their own inner demons to help others do the same. As the chapter drew to a close, the final remnants of the great white blizzard were receding into the dark, fertile earth. Ethan and Buddy stood together on the rocky outcropping overlooking the Thung Lung Valley, a position that had once been a site of tactical retreat but was now a platform of rebirth. Ethan looked down at his boots, seeing a tiny, vibrant green sprout of a mountain wildflower pushing its way through a patch of melting slush. It was a fragile, miraculous thing, a symbol of life that had endured the freezing darkness to find the sun. He looked at Buddy, who nudged his hand with a wet, cold nose, his amber eyes bright with the shared joy of the season. Ethan smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached his hazel eyes and softened the rugged angles of his face. He reached out and stroked Buddy's thick sable fur, feeling the steady thrum of the dog's heart against his palm. "We did it, Buddy," Ethan whispered, his voice caught in the gentle spring breeze. "We held the line." They stood there for a long time, the veteran and his dog, framed by the towering pines and the vast open sky of Montana. The ghosts of Detroit and the desert were still there, tucked away in the shadows of the bunker, but they no longer held the power to haunt. Ethan Halloway had successfully built his La Shan Tam Hon, Soul's Shield, A Disan, Heritage, of resilience that would protect this valley for generations to come. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a man who had finally come home to himself. As the sun set, casting a golden amber glow over the ridge, the man in the beige jacket and the sable dog turned back toward their fortress, ready to face the new life they had carved out of the mountain. The sky over Detroit was a heavy, suffocating shroud of iron gray, weeping a relentless, freezing rain that turned industrial soot into a black, slick sludge. Inside the precision metal fabrication plant, the atmosphere was a violent symphony of industrial aggression, thick with the acrid tang of ozone and grinding dust. High-pressure steam valves hissed like serpents, and the bone-shaking thud of heavy presses created a vibration Ethan Holloway could feel in his very marrow. Ethan stood at his station, a 45-year-old man with broad-shouldered strength, his hazel hair streaked with silver, and a thin beard lining his sharp, weary jaw. He wore his uniform of sanity, a rugged beige button-down shirt tucked into solid dark charcoal chinos. Over it, a heavy beige canvas jacket served as his fortress. Beside him sat Buddy, a 90-pound sable German shepherd with dark amber eyes and a black saddle, a silent sentinel who functioned as Ethan's only anchor. When a heavy steel beam suddenly slammed into the concrete floor, the sound didn't register as an accident to Ethan. It was a rocket detonating in a desert canyon years ago. As panic seized his chest and he collapsed, Buddy was there instantly, a living barrier against the prying eyes of coworkers. But the floor manager, Arthur Henderson, a man carved from sour wood with eyes like cold dishwater, saw only a damaged part slowing his line. He handed Ethan a final check and a cold dismissal. "You don't belong in a shop like this." Driven by a need for a silence that didn't judge, Ethan retreated to a remote ridge in Montana. Under a bruised purple sky, he began to dig, carving a 6x4-meter sanctuary into the earth with his own scarred hands. He ignored the mockery of Silas Vance, a tech elitist in a heated vest who called him a mole man digging his own grave. But Sarah Thorne, a lean woman with dark brown hair and eyes reflecting a quiet, shared sorrow, saw the soldier's economy in his movements. Ethan didn't use modern smart tech. He used the laws of thermodynamics. He built a rocket mass heater, a masterpiece of engineering that snaked heat beneath the stone floor, while Buddy worked as a full member of the crew, dragging pine logs in a paracord harness and sniffing the earth for signs of a landslide. They were joined briefly by Grady Iron Eye Burke, a 60-year-old retired Navy Seabee with a sandpaper growl and a missing pinky, who saw the brilliance in Ethan's self-supporting stone arch and the rusted 1944 U.S. Signal Corps door he had set into the hill. The piece of the ridge was tested when a massive autumn storm broke. The thunder triggered a violent PTSD flashback, transporting Ethan back to the copper scent of the battlefield. As he slumped against the stone wall, trembling and lost, Buddy used his full weight for deep pressure therapy, pinning Ethan's chest and whining a low-frequency lifeline until the veteran could breathe again. This shared trauma forged a bond deeper than blood. Despite his own scars, Ethan began to reach out in the shadows, secretly leaving wild honey for Martha Gable, an 82-year-old widow, and repairing the broken fences of Elias Miller, a hardened farmer who had also lost a son to war. The valley's perception changed forever when an armored military SUV crested the ridge. Lieutenant General Marcus Sterling, a monolith of discipline with 4 stars gleaming on his shoulders, stepped out and delivered a formal salute to the man they called a lunatic. Sterling offered Ethan a high-level commission to solve a military crisis, but Ethan refused. He looked at the general and said, "My biggest battlefield is right here, between my own ears. My victory is measured in a night without nightmares." This act of self-respect silenced the town's derision. When the great white blizzard arrived, paralyzing the valley and shattering the modern power grid, the high-tech homes became frozen tombs. But Ethan's bunker remained a steady 70 degrees. Buddy's alert bark led Ethan into the whiteout, where he used his engineering skills to shore up a collapsed SUV and rescue Sheriff Big Jim Callahan and his family. He brought them back to the warmth of the earth, then quietly retreated to the shadows, wanting no gratitude. When the storm broke, the townspeople arrived at his door, led by Silas and Sarah, carrying food and apologies. For the first time, the 1944 Signal Corps door became a gate instead of a barrier. They shared a communal meal on the warm stone floor, and the Mole Man became the heart of the valley. As the spring thaw began, Ethan transformed his bunker into the Soul's Shield, a sanctuary for veterans like Grizz, a bear of a man with a glass heart, and Little Pete, a twitchy youth learning to stack stone. Ethan taught them that PTSD wasn't a malfunction, but an honor scar. Sarah remained by his side, helping the families understand the silent alarms of the soldier's soul. Standing on the ridge with Buddy, watching a single green sprout push through the melting snow, Ethan finally felt the line hold. He wasn't just a survivor, he was a man who had finally come home.